Welcome back to Board Game Wednesdays. Today, we're going to do something a little bit different. Since not much happened during round 4 of our playthrough, this video is going to combine rounds 4 and 5. That way, you'll get to see all the pre-battle mobilizations and the big payoff. What massive battles will take place during these 2 rounds? Only one way to find out.
Fall, 1943. The game enters its 4th round. The Allied forces are close to launching a full-scale invasion of the European mainland, while the Axis armies attempt to tighten the noose around Moscow. The race is on to see which European capital will fall first. Beginning with the Soviets, their buildup in Archangel for an eventual push into Karelia is still underway. Their southern force will also wipe out the Japanese and Kazakh SSR, establishing a new defensive front against the incoming forces. The Soviets bought 1 artillery, 1 infantry, and 1 tank for Russia, and 1 infantry and 1 artillery for the Caucasus. In the attack phase, 1 artillery and 1 infantry from the Caucasus attacked the Japanese and Kazakh, with fighter support from Russia. Up north, 1 tank from Russia blitzed through West Russia on its way to reinforce Archangel, capturing the undefended territory. Back in Kazakh SSR, Soviet fire eliminated the Japanese tank with 1 roll, losing an infantry to the Japanese defensive fire. In the non-combat phase, the fighters returned to Russia and the Soviets reinforced their defenses in Archangel. Looking at the German defenses in Karelia, the Soviet players considered moving up their timeline and striking the territory next round. As always, the German turn would dictate their course of action. The Soviets deployed their builds and collected 20 IPCs, the exact same amount collected during the previous round. Time was running out for Germany and the Axis as a whole. With the Allies advancing on Karelia from both the east and west, the Germans simply could not produce enough to realistically hold the territory, much less launch a counteroffensive. Their salvation, Germany reckoned, lied in Africa and with the Japanese. If the Africa Corps could break through the weak South African infantry, 7 British IPCs lay unguarded for the taking. And in Asia, the Japanese armies could overwhelm the Soviets given time to amass and reach them. The Germans, however, would need to keep the Soviets occupied for an eastern offensive to work, all while holding off the Western Allies. So, the Germans would keep hold of their positions at sea and keep the garrison in Karelia, reinforcing each. Army Group Center would be their new offensive tool. The Germans built 2 artillery for Karelia, 1 artillery for Italy, a tank, an artillery, and 2 infantry for Germany, and 1 sub each for the Baltic and Mediterranean seas. The hopes of maintaining a fighting force in Africa were gone for the Germans. Instead, High Command would get as much use out of them as they could, knowing their fate was surely sealed. 1 tank and 1 artillery moved into Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, while an infantry crossed into the Transjordan, seizing the unguarded territory. While it didn't have much use for them in the current predicament, the Axis did now have control of the Suez Canal. The remaining German units would be transported back to Italy, aiding in its defense. Up north, a tank from Karelia blitzed into West Russia, taking the territory, then back into Karelia. The Germans would take any IPCs they could get. Finally, in an effort to cripple Soviet manufacturing, the Germans would give strategic bombing a try, sending their bomber into the Caucasus. The bombing run succeeded, dealing a whopping 6 IPCs worth of damage, the most a single bomber could do. The Germans saw more measured success in Africa, where the significantly sized-down Africa Corps eliminated the South African defenders while losing an artillery. The doorway to Africa was now open. With combat over, the bomber returned to Germany, and the remaining units in Egypt were pulled back to Italy. If landings in France occurred, or if the Mediterranean fleet fell, Germany would not simply let the Allies waltz into Italy. They would have to fight to take it. In Poland, Army Group Center was reinforced with 4 infantry. The Germans hoped they could have 1 more turn of reinforcing before mobilizing the army. If Karelia fell, however, that would no longer be an option. Germany deployed their build and collected 42 IPCs. If nothing else, they were still leading the board alongside Japan in IPC count. Having had ample time to build up, the British Empire was ready to land on the European mainland. Initial landings would be small, but quickly reinforced. The UK's build would reflect that. The Empire built 1 tank, 1 artillery, and 2 infantry for the United Kingdom, 1 submarine for Sea Zone 6, and 3 artillery for India. All combat moves this turn would be bloodless. Starting in Europe, every British combat unit in the United Kingdom conducted an amphibious assault into undefended northwestern Europe, taking control of a territory bordering Germany. In South Asia, the tank in India blitzed into Burma, seizing the territory before returning. The British would not end up making any moves in the non-combat phase. They trusted the Americans to eliminate the German tank loose in Africa, and they didn't see the lone German infantry in the Transjordan as much of a threat. Instead, they would deploy their builds and collect 32 IPCs. Losing the East Indies took a chunk out of their income, but with the way the board was developing, they weren't too concerned. If it wasn't before, the pressure was all on Japan. They needed to get an army into position to strike Russia stat if the Axis team wanted a shot at winning. Japan would build 3 tanks for Manchuria, joining the push on Moscow, and 1 tank and 1 infantry for Japan, joining the transport train to French Indochina Thailand. India was, after all, still an objective. The convoy would be bolstered by a destroyer and a transport bound for Sea Zone 62. Like the British, the Japanese would see no fighting this turn. Only 1 combat action would occur when the force in Yakut occupied Evenki National Okrug. Down south, all units in and around the East Indies would sail to Sea Zone 36, dropping the units off in French Indochina Thailand. The army there would also be reinforced with the infantry and artillery from the Japanese mainland. Further north, the forces in Manchuria advanced towards Soviet territory, with the tanks blitzing all the way to Xinjiang. Next turn, all available Japanese units would link up in Xinjiang, creating a sizable army before pushing into Russia. They just needed Germany to hold on for a little bit longer. The Japanese deployed their build and collected 39 IPCs. Confident in the direction the game was going, the Japanese were not concerned with the slight drop in production. At the beginning of their turn, the Americans contemplated an operation against Italy. Germany was vulnerable, and occupying the territory would certainly push an early endgame and victory for the Allies. The German fleet, however, was still too close in strength to the American one. If the naval assault failed, most of their transports would be vulnerable to a German counterattack. The loss of that many US transports would set the invasion of Europe for all Allied powers back significantly, and thus wasn't worth the risk. The US would instead continue its buildup. They purchased 8 infantry and 1 destroyer for the East Coast and 1 destroyer for the West Coast. Once Italy was taken and the Allies had a strong foothold in Europe, the bulk of American IPCs would move to the Pacific. Continuing its tried-and-true tactic, the American bomber left the United Kingdom for the factory in Germany. In North Africa, the expeditionary units in Algeria advanced into Libya, occupying it. The Americans held off on blitzing into Egypt. They did not want to overextend their line and risk a German counterattack. In the Pacific, all naval units from Sea Zone 56, including a transport carrying 1 infantry and 1 artillery, sailed to Sea Zone 44, launching an invasion of the Solomon Islands. The American bomber again survived the German flak, dealing 2 IPCs worth of damage to the factory. In the Pacific, the battleship bombardment destroyed Japanese defenders, who put up no resistance against the American invasion force. With the Solomon Islands now occupied, the US had carved out a line of islands it could now launch operations from. Its Pacific fleet, however, was still too weak to risk pulling in range of the IJN. The US Navy would have to wait for the right opportunity to strike, building up a second strike force in the meantime. With combat concluded, the bomber returned to the United Kingdom, and the transports on the East Coast took the infantry and artillery to French West Africa. Since there was no threat of the transports being hit, their escort destroyer instead reinforced the fleet in Sea Zone 13. 4 of the transports from the Sea Zone sailed back to Sea Zone 11, keeping the transport train in motion. With the US Navy out of range of Sea Zone 64, the Americans were worried the Japanese might try an amphibious assault against Alaska. To deter this, the Americans moved their tank in the western United States up to Alaska, reinforcing the defenders there. Given the situation in Asia, the US doubted Alaska would be a target. but they couldn't be too sure. The US deployed their build, collecting 41 IPCs, almost back to the original number. By the end of round 4, the Allied powers had maneuvered themselves into striking positions. The following turn would undoubtedly see massive battles across the board. We returned to the Soviets at the start of round 5. It was decided. The time to assault Karelia was now. Japan was still at least 3 turns away from mounting an effective offensive, and with German forces pushed out of Soviet territory, the Red Army could build back up and strike the approaching Japanese, as well as aid the Western Allies in knocking out Germany. Before building, the Soviets spent 6 IPCs on repairs to their factory in the Caucasus, then building 2 artillery and 2 infantry for Russia. Back in Russia, the artillery from Kazakh SSR advanced into Novosibirsk, recapturing the territory. Finally, the offensive that had been brewing for 2 whole rounds got underway. The Soviets sent all available combat units into Karelia, blitzing through West Russia on the way. The Red Army opened strong, landing 5 hits to the German 4. Both teams took the hits on their infantry. The Soviets continued their effective attack, rolling 4 hits to the Germans' 2. The remaining Germans were eliminated on the 3rd roll, who got 3 final hits. By the end, Soviet units occupied Karelia for the first time since the start of the game, this time with 6 tanks. The Soviet Air Force returned to Russia, and artillery and infantry from Russia moved into Archangel and Vologda. These units would prevent the Japanese from blitzing into the capital this round. The Soviets deployed their build and collected 22 IPCs, rising for the first time since round 2. With all 3 factories back under their control and no German forces across the entire front, the Soviets might have definitively flipped the balance of power. The German players were not hopeless quite yet. Despite their losses, the Japanese advances into the Soviet Union were promising. Germany needed to do everything they could to help. It was time to mobilize Army Group Center, despite how understrength it was. Germany repaired 2 IPCs of factory damage, then built 2 tanks, 3 artillery, and 2 infantry for Germany, and 3 infantry for Italy. They kept 1 IPC banked for their next turn. With Africa open, the tank in Anglo-Egyptian Sudan blitzed into Italian East Africa and Rhodesia, freely occupying both. The infantry in Transjordan similarly occupied Persia. In Europe, the Luftwaffe would continue its reign of terror with a strategic bombing raid in the Caucasus. The Soviet flak failed again, and the German bomber delivered an effective 5 IPCs worth of damage. With offensives concluded, Army Group Center mobilized, taking up positions in Ukraine. This army would either aid the Japanese in an upcoming offensive or tie up Red Army troops for one more turn, whatever they could do to prolong the game. Unfortunately for them, that included abandoning their Baltic Fleet buildup. The writing was on the wall, and the German players knew that casting off more ships was only pulling away vital resources for land operations, sending them to a theater they no longer hoped to win. With this in mind, the valuable fighters from the carrier in Sea Zone 5 flew to Germany, defending the homeland itself rather than the sea that bordered it. Germany deployed their build and collected 38 IPCs, bumped up to 39 with the one saved earlier. For the first time all game, the German economy dropped. The British Empire was ready for major operations against German forces in Europe. The last hurdle in the Atlantic was the German Baltic Fleet, and with the Kriegsmarine being abandoned by the German team, the Royal Navy would sail to destroy what remained. The British built 1 tank, 1 artillery, 1 infantry, and 1 transport for the United Kingdom. The German Navy would surely be resting at the bottom of the ocean by the end of the turn. So the British no longer concerned themselves with building support vessels, just ground troops and transports for the invasion. They also built 3 artillery for India, preparing for offensives in that theater as well. Only 1 British combat move would take place outside of Europe. An infantry, artillery, and a tank from India assaulted the German infantry in Persia, a thorn in their side. The rest of the fighting would take place in the west. All British units in Norway invaded Finland, and the British forces in northwestern Europe liberated France. Finally, the Royal Navy mobilized all their warships in Sea Zone 6, attacking the Kriegsmarine in the Baltic Sea. The fighting in Persia would be handled first. The British failed to eliminate the German infantry on the first roll, losing an infantry of their own instead. On the second roll, however, the British wiped them out, enduring no further casualties. The artillery and the tank reoccupied the territory, ending German expansion into Asia. Now, for the real spectacle, the largest naval battle of the game thus far. With the clear upper hand, the Royal Navy destroyed the German fleet in a mere 2 rolls, losing only a submarine and tanking some damage on their battleship. The northern seas were now clear. British troops could pour into Europe with little to no opposition. Case in point, the transports would take combat units from the UK to Sea Zone 5, deploying them into northwestern Europe. An assault into Germany proper was sure to commence in the next few rounds. The UK deployed their build and collected 37 IPCs. Once the Americans cleared out the last of the German Africa Corps, the British would be competing with the Japanese for the largest economy on the board. With the Allies occupying large swaths of German territory, the race was on for Japan to attack Russia and India. Japan would build 2 tanks and 1 infantry for Manchuria, 2 infantry and 2 artillery for Japan, and 1 fighter for the carrier in Sea Zone 62. Japan needed to go on the offensive sooner rather than later. Thus, Japan would forego more buildup and move into striking positions. All units from French Indochina Thailand advanced into Burma, being joined by a tank and an infantry from Japan. All units in Evenki National Okrug and 2 tanks in Xinjiang pushed into Novosibirsk, taking on the Soviet artillery. The first roll destroyed the defenders, who took out 1 infantry in return. The Japanese could now directly attack the Soviet heartland. In the non-combat phase, the 2 transports in Sea Zone 36 sailed to Sea Zone 62, keeping the transport train alive. The battleship and a fighter around Japan traveled down to Sea Zone 36, ready to support an invasion. The infantry in Anhui and 3 tanks in Manchuria moved into Xinjiang, ready to advance into Russia. If they needed to, Japan could launch their massive offensive in the upcoming round. Japan deployed their build and collected 40 IPCs. Neither Axis power held the highest IPC count anymore. The United States was almost ready to launch their invasion of Italy. They wanted just a little more naval firepower to comfortably attack the Kriegsmarine in the Mediterranean. Over in the Pacific, the 2 Japanese fleets were keeping the Americans on the periphery of Japanese territories. To alleviate this, the Americans would build a second Pacific fleet, one that could challenge the IJN around their home island, leaving the American Expeditionary Force with only the IJN's southern force to deal with. In keeping with the plan, the United States built 1 tank, 1 artillery, 2 infantry, and 1 cruiser for the eastern United States, and 1 cruiser for the west coast. The spending left them with 1 IPC left over for their next turn. The bomber in the UK again targeted the factory in Germany. The tanks, and only the tanks in Libya, blitzed through Egypt into Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, hunting down the last of the Germans in Africa. The American bomber survived the German flak and dealt a whopping 6 IPCs worth of damage to the factory. In the non-combat phase, US forces in French West Africa advanced to French Equatorial Africa, cutting off any routes of escape for the Germans. The transports in Sea Zone 23 returned to American waters, while the transports and destroyer there took the infantry in the eastern United States to Morocco. The US deployed their build and collected 41 IPCs, 42 with their 1 banked from earlier. America once again had the strongest economy on the board.
And with that, we finished our first ever 2-round video of Board Game Wednesdays. It looks like the Axis only hope rests in a massive Japanese offensive. Can they pull it off, or will the Soviets and Indians hold the line long enough for Berlin to fall? Tune in next Board Game Wednesday to find out, when we'll cover the 6th and maybe 7th round of this playthrough. What would you have done in the player's shoes? Let us know down in the comments. And as always, be sure to subscribe to EMFX Studios for more fun, nerdy content.